G'day everyone, Rune
and Pickled Dill here,
bringing you a special episode for the GSA Universe following the titular, Pickle, which name did we decide to call her by again?
Really, Rune?
What? It's not my fault that the girl has so many aliases. You sure we couldn't have done Gary's special?
That was taken by Plus and Electro.
Okay, that makes sense. What about Richie?
Buster and Ronan took him.
Well, don't complain if I keep getting the name wrong during this.
Fine, but before we get into things, we should probably introduce the other person who has been working with us, and whose channel this is on.
Yo, it's Dex here, and today I'm allowing Rune and Pickle to take over the channel, because they totally didn't lock me in a basement and force me to do it.
Now, enough banter, let's begin the story. It's been about an hour since the raid on the Team Rocket hideout in Celadon City, and Annie, Oakley and Leaf have only just stopped running to catch their breath. With the base in Celadon destroyed, there's only one place that they can go for safety: Pokemon Tech. Wanting to play things safe for now, they stick to the forests as they begin to make their way towards the relative safety of their old training grounds. With it being so late at night, however, it is not long before the trio are forced to stop and make camp for fear of going off course or injuring themselves if they stumble around in the dark for too long. With a chance to breathe, Leaf notices that her Marowak is hurt. Realizing that he must have taken a hit from one of those loser grunts during the raid, she begins to treat his wound, taking great care to not cause the Pokemon any further pain. Annie, who'd been about to tell Leaf to pass her some matches for the fire, notices how gentle her younger sister is being with her Marowak, causing a frown to tug at her lips before she puts on a smirk, telling Giselle to stop pampering her Pokemon and pass her a match. Leaf barely suppresses a flinch at the name, before grabbing the box of matches out of her bag and throwing it hard at Annie's face. She glares as the blonde simply catches it with a sing-song, "Thank you!" before telling her that she's not pampering her Marowak. He's hurt and she's treating his wound. After all, she can't fight with an injured Pokemon. Hearing this, Oakley decides to enter the conversation, snarking that never seemed to be an issue back in training camp, an odd note of pride to her callous statement. Leaf remembers those days all too well. She'd been selected out of her whole beginner's class to be placed in a secret special training program. She'd been so excited when she first arrived, her heart feeling like it was going to leap out of her chest. She'd been so naive back then, so ignorantly unaware of the hell that awaited her.
Leaf stands in a lineup of children her own age. There are about 15 including her from what she can tell. A batch of fresh-faced trainees ready to prove themselves as they stand before their new instructor. The sound of chatter echoes in the massive room that they had all been led to. Green wants to join in the conversations, but she's too jittery with nerves and excitement. A loud voice then booms for them to stop talking and stand at attention, causing every mouth to fall silent and eyes to look up at the podium at the front of the room. Their new professor, a man whose name is Viper if she remembers correctly, looks down at them from there. From the stiff purple mohawk to the cold hard look in his eyes, he seems more like a drill instructor than a school teacher. She scolds herself for thinking that. He's probably just strict. This is a special program for the best of the best. Or maybe he was in the military but had to retire because of some injury. Yeah, that one sounded most likely. Professor Viper's flinty eyes flash as he begins a speech, and as he does, Leaf feels the giddy sense of excitement vanish from the very first sentence out of his mouth. From this day forward, this facility will be your home, your school, and your own personal gauntlet. The sinking feeling in her stomach only increases as he goes on to tell them their lives before don't matter. Who they are currently doesn't matter. Their hopes and dreams don't matter. They're told to forget whatever they were led to believe about this program, because they will soon find that it is nothing like they were told. They are now the property of Team Rocket, and they will perform to the organization's standards, or they will be discarded. However, those who prove their value, specifically the top 5 highest scoring candidates, will be offered a one-time opportunity to join a special and illustrious group within the organization, one that will grant them power, prestige, and the ability to quench the burning ambition they were all identified as having. Such positions will not be granted lightly though, so they had best be ready to give it their all, or die trying.
The next several months pass by in a blur of mind-bending classes and back-breaking training. Leaf excels in her classes, which consist of written tests, hacking, and practicing social manipulation. The physical aspect is much harder though. She's small, so sneaking through the air vents is a breeze for her, and she's good at being quiet. However, unless it's a Pokemon battle, she can't fight to save her life. which, if this place has taught her anything, she'll very well need to one day. Every time they have the students pair up to spar, she's the one that leaves with bruises and cracked bones. But if there's one thing that she can pride herself on, it's that she's never been the one to call the fight off. Every time her opponent knocks her down, she gets back to her feet, forcing the proctor to call the match before her opponent does any permanent damage. The children that entered this place stopped being children long ago. Now, they're nothing more than attack growlers, trying everything they can to appease their masters and prove their worth, whether it be by furthering themselves or grinding a rival into the dust. She'd gotten attached to the ratata that they'd given her on the first day of her stay here. It was a mistake she swore to never make again. Attachments are only a weakness here, and any weakness will be used to try and make you shatter. Yet, she can't help but remember every Pokemon she loses, scratching another line into the underside of her bed whenever another joins their number. She knows Professor Viper would be furious if he saw such sentimentality, but she cannot help herself. Perhaps that is the problem right there. If she's too weak to resist even this, what chance does she have at making it into the top 5? And if she doesn't, what will become of her then? Since she's fairly certain that washouts don't get to return to their old classes, or their families.
Shaking her head to free herself from these memories, Leaf turns to Annie and Oakley with a hard look, defiantly retorting that unlike back in training, they don't have an infinite supply of spare Pokemon to use when they burn through their current ones, since she was already forced to hand back all the Pokemon she borrowed from Team Rocket for the St. Anne tournament, so they need to make sure these ones don't break until they can make the rendezvous. It's not some schoolgirl kindness if that's what they're thinking, it's just common sense, something her sisters could use a bit more of, since she has no intention of dragging dead weight behind her. For a moment, Annie and Oakley look mollified, as if these sharp words so reminiscent of the Leaf they know have convinced them, though that is before Oakley speaks up, smirking if that's what she needs to tell herself to sleep at night, so be it, though she ought to know by now she can lie to the world, to her Pokemon, even to herself, but she can't lie to them. They know her better than anyone, and it's pretty obvious that being Giselle for so long has changed her, and not for the better, so it's high time she fix that, or it'll get ugly when they meet up with her. Though Oakley does not mention a name, all three women shudder involuntarily at the reference, knowing all too well what comes of getting on Domino's bad side, though this does at least put an effective end to the conversation as the blue-haired spy had hoped, allowing the trio to get some rest, since when morning comes, they will be on the move again, possibly with Interpol on their tail thanks to the boss's unruly younger brat wanting to play policeman. Or at least, Annie and Oakley rest, while Leaf takes first watch, a standard 3-operative squad practice, to ensure they are not taken by surprise during the night. Not that Leaf could sleep anyway after that exchange. Taking up position against a tree, the youngest member of this little triad looks out at the surrounding forested area, her knees tucked against her chest while Marowak naps against her side. Though she tries to keep her mind on the task at hand, it cannot help but wonder, not only to the events of earlier this evening, but also to what her sisters had said. They were obviously just trying to get under her skin as payback for the match throwing, right? But if this is the case, why can't she let it go? She's endured far worse than a few mean words. It doesn't make any sense. The worse even than that, it's created something that wasn't there before. Doubt. What if they're right, and she has changed to become more like Giselle?
She supposes she did spend over a year as her, which is way longer than any of her previous undercover missions, living every day surrounded by those goody two-shoes idiots and their maddening ideas of trust and basic goodness of people. It would have been sickening if it weren't for the fact that it made them so easy to manipulate and integrate into their little friend circle. However, even as she thinks it, something strikes false about this idea to Leaf. Since, try as she might, she can't bring herself to hate them. They had treated her well, better than she deserved. Gary and Misty and Ash. At once, Leaf feels cold, struck again by that sensation she had felt when fleeing the base. That innate knowledge that Ash had been in existential trouble, and worse, by the worry that she had felt for him there. She should not feel anything for him since he was her mark, her target, nothing more, but all the same this feeling does not fade, nor does the unease, staying with her long after Oakley relieves her of watch and she lies sleeplessly on the forest floor. watching the sky change. Finally, morning arrives with Annie telling her sisters to get moving since they don't have a second to waste. Professional as ever, Oakley nods. While refusing to let her sleepless night slow her down, Leaf does likewise. With this, the trio depart after stopping just long enough to remove any trace of their presence in case they are being followed. For a time, the three spies move in perfect silence, proving why they are among the small handful to be selected for the elite 00 unit. However, even the most skilled spies are still human, with it not being long before the sound of Annie's stomach growling forces them to stop. Tersely, Oakley tells her sister to keep it down, though with a petulant edge to her voice, Annie snaps back that she's hungry since they haven't eaten in over 24 hours. As if in response, Oakley's own stomach then begins to growl hungrily, with the blue-haired woman admitting that perhaps it would be prudent if they ate something. To this end, she instructs Annie to call forth her Espion and use its telepathic abilities to search for any human minds in the area, since if there's people, there'll be food. Fortunately, this is an easy job for the evolution, with it pausing only briefly to scan around before taking off at a sprint while Annie, Oakley, and Leaf follow in hot pursuit. As it turns out, the trio are closer to a road than they think, as after only 20 minutes they come out of the tree line onto Route 5 where they spot a convenience store not too far away. A quick scan of the perimeter tells them that it's deserted aside from a single human worker and a Teddy Ursa who's helping stock the shelves. Good. Together, the three of them and their Pokemon would be able to get whatever they need and get out without their marks being any the wiser.
Forming up in a way that only those who have an innate knowledge of each other from many successful jobs together can have, Annie, Oakley, and Leaf enter the store, pretending to casually browse the wares as they slowly fan out, with the older girls making their way towards the counter where they begin flirting with a human worker to serve as a distraction, while Leaf slowly shadows Teddy Ursa. By staying behind the little normal type, she's able to deftly tuck a few items under her shirt and into her socks without being noticed. While up at the counter, Annie and Oakley simply use their sleight of hand training to slip whole bottles of drink into their pockets, trusting the man is too besotted with them to even notice if he were to look down. When they have enough, Leaf gives the signal to pull out, knocking over a box of Jangmo-O's cereal, which the harried Teddy Ursa scurries to clean up, leaving the girl free to walk right past it with her stolen stash unnoticed, while Annie sweetly apologizes for her klutzy sister, paying for the cereal and a small packet of gum before the trio stroll right out the front door, their heist having been a complete success. However, before they can be on their way, Oakley makes the wise decision to use the store's video payphone, making her way round to the side of the parking lot and dialing the private number known only to members of their unit to check in on the situation. To her most unpleasant surprise, the face that picks up is none other than Domino, a rare sight, as normally a lower ranked member of the group would have this job. Things must be really bad if the commander herself is on phone duty. Spotting these thoughts as though they were written on Oakley's forehead, Domino flatly states that they need to get back to Pokemon Tech now, since they are currently in the process of assessing the damage after last night, and need all operatives accounted for as soon as possible. Quailing a little under their leader's harsh gaze, Oakley confirms they will double their speed, a claim that does little to satisfy the blonde, with her only response before ending the call being, "See that you do."
With this unnerving exchange out of the way, Oakley leads her sisters back into the trees, figuring it's best they get some distance between themselves and the scene of their crime just in case either of the employees figure out something is amiss. Knowing her well enough to see that something is wrong, both Leaf and Annie ask what happened, though in a flat spy tone, Oakley simply tells them to come on. Unfortunately, as they begin racing through the trees, Leaf finds herself struggling to keep up in her sleep-deprived state, a task which is not made easier thanks to the uneven terrain. Glancing over her shoulder after a particularly loud snap of a falling tree branch, Oakley sees just how far Leaf is lagging and rolls her eyes, before pulling her Ariados's Pokeball from her belt and lobbing it behind her. In a flash, the giant spider appears next to Leaf, already running, while from up ahead, Oakley tells the younger girl to get on the spider since she's slowing them down, causing way too much noise and they still need the stuff she's carrying. Not wanting to argue, Leaf quickly jumps onto Ariados, holding onto the long-legged Pokemon as it speeds up to bring her alongside the two older women, with the trio continuing to run through the forest without stop until Oakley is sure they have covered sufficient ground. Only when this criteria has been met does the blue-haired young woman call for them to stop, telling Leaf to get off of her Ariados before tossing her a caffeinated soda, which she instructs her to drink since she looks like she's about to pass out. Nodding in understanding, Leaf guzzles the soda, while joining her sisters for a breakfast of chips, candy bars, and anything that'll give them quick energy for the next leg of their sprint. As they eat, Annie sighs in mock melancholy, wishing that she was still little enough to ride on Ariados, while beside her, Oakley rolls her eyes, saying that it's a good thing she can't get away with that anymore. Otherwise, she'd never get her Ariados back, and Annie would get completely unfit. This earns an indignant squawk from the blonde as she demands to know why that wasn't an issue with Leaf, to which Oakley retorts that unlike Annie, she's just tired, not lazy. All the while, Leaf smiles behind her drink, this familiar bickering feeling like the closest thing to home she has anymore.
Sadly, this reprieve is a brief one, as when they're done eating, Oakley orders the trio to gather up the remaining supplies and get back on their feet, since they still have a long way to go and need to make haste. As carrying all their provisions in their pockets and hidden under their clothes is not only inefficient but also highly conspicuous, the group decide to store them in the backpack Leaf had been carrying as part of her Giselle disguise. Figuring they won't need any more of the schoolgirl's affectations anymore, they quickly upend the pack onto the ground, before Annie and Oakley begin stuffing in as many supplies as the bag can hold. Leaf, however, is stopped from doing so by the sight of something thick and rectangular which lies atop the pile of discarded items, Giselle's diary. While initially this had been just another way to sell the ruse of an airheaded little girl, Leaf had found the act of journaling as Giselle a useful means to craft her persona, as it had allowed her to inhabit the fake girl's headspace, so to speak. Or at least, that was what she had thought at the time, but now after Annie and Oakley's insinuations last night, she cannot help but wonder if perhaps in entering the mind of Giselle, she in turn allowed something of the character into herself as well. Needing to know, Leaf almost compulsively snatches up the diary and flips to the first entries. They are pathetic to say the least, so clearly manufactured that anyone with even the most basic knowledge of spycraft or human psychology could tell that nothing in them is genuine. Just looking at them makes her want to cringe with shame, though she quickly reminds herself that she is not doing a writing critique, she is looking for answers, and so presses on. As she reads, she begins to notice how her writings change, beginning to feel more genuine as she goes on, especially when she writes about how her Cubone and later Marowak is getting stronger, even detailing an anecdote she had almost forgotten about how Cubone had nuzzled up to her one cold night on the road, freely offering his own body heat to make sure she could sleep soundly.
Finally, she reaches the last entry, dated to the day before, detailing her reunion with Ash. Back at the Pokemon Center, she reads about how relieved she was that he's okay, and how incredible his battle with Misty was. Then she reads the final line, "I want to have a battle with Ash just like that." And for a moment, she cannot breathe as she is reminded of another person she once was. Not a deep cover role she played for Team Rocket, nor a spy in training, but a girl that signed up for the best Pokemon trainer school in Kanto so she could learn to have amazing battles like the ones she saw on TV during the Pokemon League. In that instant, Leaf misses that girl terribly, wishing more than anything that she could be her again. Though it's a fleeting thought, as a moment later her training recenters her and she tears the book in half, scattering its pages to the wind. However, as she watches them go, she wonders who truly wrote them. Was a 003 simply playing a role, Giselle slowly becoming more than just a cover? Or was it the last embers of that girl, trying to show that in spite of all that Leaf has done in pursuit of her ambition, she still exists within her? 6 months have passed since Leaf entered the program, with her toiling tirelessly under the watchful eye of Professor Viper and his select group of aides, all sporting the same black outfits emblazoned with a red R. However, today is different. Today, instead of morning classes, they are all assembled in the same massive room where Viper had given his commencement speech, since according to the Mohawked Man, they have a very special guest. From her place among the students who have not yet flunked out, Leaf wonders who this might be. Maybe the illustrious Team Rocket boss, or someone of similar gravitas. However, to her surprise, when Viper steps away from the podium, the person who takes his place is a young woman with curled blonde hair, who introduces herself as Domino, the second in command of the Tulip unit and the one who will be overseeing their final exam, which, for all intents and purposes, has now begun.
This causes a rumble of murmuring to fill the room before Viper orders the trainees to all fall silent, and while Leaf does so like all the rest, inside she is screaming. This is very bad, as currently she is ranked 8th, meaning she will not make the cut. To make matters worse, Domino had not specified how long this final exam would be, meaning she has no idea if she has enough time to boost her ranking. When Domino dismisses them, Leaf begins heading back to her dorm, figuring she needs to start making a plan if she wants to turn things around. Though it seems she is not the only one strategizing, as before she can even get halfway, she finds herself being pulled into a broom closet by 2 sets of hands. Figuring this must be an attempt by some of her rivals to pick off a weak link, Leaf reaches for the Pokeball of her newly assigned Cubone, though before she can lay a finger on it, one of her kidnappers plucks it from her belt with a mischievous giggle, while the other lays a hand across her mouth and tells her she'll release it if the brunette agrees not to scream. Eyes finally acclimating to the dark, Leaf recognizes the speakers as one of the candidates brought in from the advanced class, making her a few years older than her, the one with short ice blue hair. Oakley, she believes her name is, while the one holding Cubone's ball is her blonde sister Annie. Nodding to show that she accepts the terms, Leaf feels the hold in her mouth be released as she demands to know what these two want. Coyly, the blonde smirks that they want to make her an offer, but if she's going to be all snippy, they might just leave, which would be a shame for little Leaf, since this opportunity might be the only way she makes it into the top 5.
Coolly, Oakley chides that there's no need to provoke the younger girl, since she has every right to be suspicious. After all, there's probably a million questions going through her head like now. Like, why single me out? What's in it for them? And what's the catch? Though Leaf hates to admit it, those had been her exact thoughts. But playing her cards close to her chest, she instead simply asks what the offer is that they're proposing. Eyes flashing like a pair of hungry Persian, the sisters explain that currently they are ranked 6 and 7, though after breaking into Viper's office to sneak a peek at the grading metric, they've discovered that it's a surprisingly close race, meaning if they can shake things up a little in the final exam, they might be able to shoot up through the ranks and secure spots in the top 5. Having a good idea of where this is going, Leaf asks if the reason they've come to her is that when they say shake things up, they really mean sabotage, and it would be too obvious if one of them did it. Nodding approvingly, the blue-haired girl praises that Leaf catches on fast, stating that she's seemingly out of the runnings, so there's no clear motive if she did the dirty work. Now it's Leaf's turn to adopt a cool tone, replying that if she's already a goner, why should she stick her neck out for them? To which Annie gives a seemingly friendly smile as she replies that just like there'd be no clear indication for Leaf to help them, there'd also be no clear link for them to her, meaning they can pull her up through the ranks with them by throwing a few practice matches and tripping up a few of her rivals. This way they can all win without Viper or this domino lady catching on. She just has to do this favor for them first and then they'll take care of her. Deal? That evening at dinner, Leaf sits alone, her eyes locked on the far table where Little Miss Number 1 is eating her dinner, also alone. There's nothing obvious to indicate any weakness in her guard or her physique. The only possible flaw that she can see is that she puts so much sugar in her coffee that Leaf has to wonder if her teeth are riddled with cavities. Just don't drink the stuff if you hate the taste so much. Can she taste anything in that other than sugar?
Wait, she probably can't. If she slipped something into her food, she'd never be able to taste it over the taste of sugar. Maybe something to make her sick, like food poisoning. She frowns down at her plate of half-eaten food. No, that won't be enough to take her out of the running completely. She'll just be held up in the infirmary for a few days, maybe a week, then be right back at it. It needs to be something more permanent. A bottle of bleach pops into her head before she immediately discards it. Bleach is dangerous, and very easy to screw up. She wants her out of the running, not dead. She then stands up as she hears the bell calling the end to dinner. Thankfully, she was able to eat all of it while she thought, or she'd be hungry later. Though as she places her dirty dishes on the trolley and turns to leave the room, she's suddenly shoved to the floor as the cruel sneering voice of the second place candidate, a big British girl from the advanced class like Annie and Oakley, tells her to stay in the dirt, where she belongs. Instinctively, Leaf prepares to snap back an insult at the older girl, as to show weakness now will only invite further targeting, though this is all forgotten when she sees the Pokemon strutting by number 2's side. It's a Toxapex. Perfect. Well, this just sucks. This is Leaf and Annie's joint reaction when Oakley tells them of the change in heading. As following Domino's demand they pick up the pace, they've been forced to abandon their relatively safe route, which would allow them to stay exclusively in the woods, in favor of the fast but more dangerous path which entails making their way through Saffron City. Not only does this risk exposure, as by now their names and maybe faces will be among the Team Rocket members still at large, assuming those Interpol jerks were smart enough to take the data from the boss's computer, but also it means a sizable amount of backtracking, as they were heading north while the city is to the east. All the same, the blue-haired sister will brook no argument on this, stating their leader is already impatient with them, so dilly-dallying in any way is sure to get them in more hot water than they're probably already in.
As a result, it is a rather sour few days that follow, with the three sisters each stewing in their own private frustrations, so that when they finally reach the city at the end of the week, the cracks are definitely beginning to show. However, even tired and dirty and thoroughly pissed off at their boss, they are still Rocket elites, which means approaching this task with the same proficiency as everything else. So to this end, the first order of business is to hide their faces, meaning swiping a couple of hats off a clothing store clearance rack, the sort of things that no one will notice, as being recognized here will likely result in a fight, and a fight will draw the attention of the Jennies, something that they cannot afford right now. Thankfully, it is a sunny day, meaning that they don't look out of place as they don their new headwear, a fedora for Annie which she wears at a rakish tilt, and a Breton cap for Oakley, which she at least has the good sense to wear plainly as to not stand out. As for Leaf, she feels herself grimace as her sisters smirkingly present her with an ivy cap, adorned in rhinestones with a big letter G. On top of being garish and highly conspicuous, it is also an obvious attempt to taunt her once more with the Giselle name, having clearly clocked how easy it got a rise out of her the last time. However, refusing to play her sisters' game, she instead flatly asks what the G is meant to stand for, her cool demeanor turning it back on them and forcing them to flounder for an answer as they had not expected this. After a moment, Annie pipes up, stating that it stands for green, since her name is Leaf Green after all. This answer stuns Leaf, as she had not considered that, having almost forgotten that surname amidst the sea of aliases she'd been forced to wear. However, this is not the shocking part, as what really gets her is the possibility that maybe her sisters had not been using this hat as a subtle means to hurt her. Has she really gotten so suspicious that she cannot even trust her own sisters? No, that's not right. Suspicion isn't a weakness, it's a strength, her greatest strength and the thing that's kept her alive until now. So why is she now thinking of it as a flaw and trust of all things as a virtue? Arceus help her. Maybe she has spent too long as Giselle, too long among them that it's changed her. Truthfully, Leaf doesn't know anymore, though she does know one thing. She has to keep moving forward, since the alternative, well, it's not even worth considering.
With this in mind, Leaf stays quiet as they begin the next stage of their mission. Cross the city as quickly as possible without making it too obvious where they're going or that they're hurrying. To best facilitate this ruse, the trio pretend to look in at several shops, glancing in the windows, making some vapid comment about how some non-existent friend would like an item on display, then moving on. Simple and effective cover. That is until they come across an electronics shop which has a bunch of TVs in the window, as while Annie and Oakley are able to maintain their act, Leaf is transfixed by the face in the screen. It's Gary battling it out at the Pokemon League. However, that shock is nothing compared to the one she receives upon seeing his opponent, as it's the last person she had ever expected to see again. Ash, or rather, someone who has Ash's face, his eyes, his build, even that hideous vest he'd started wearing during his absence. But this is not Ash. Maybe it's all of her training as a spy that lets her see it. Maybe it's the Giselle in her. But somehow, she just knows. And as that revelation hits her, so does a familiar and unpleasant feeling in her stomach. Though she tries to pretend she doesn't recognize it, it is a vain effort, as she felt it when she lost her Rattata, she felt it when she destroyed the diary, and she feels it now. Grief. However, before she can descend too deeply into that rabbit hole, Annie and Oakley forcibly bring her back to the present, as Oakley throws an arm over her shoulder with such force that it almost knocks her over. Meanwhile, Annie asks what Giselle is so fascinated by, though she gets her answer not from Leaf, but from following her eyeline to the battle on the screen. Upon doing likewise, Oakley lets out a low whistle, before commenting in a voice that she makes sure is low and casual that the brown-haired boy's Pokemon sure are strong, but she supposes it makes sense, since she thinks she remembers reading somewhere that he was trained by the regional champ. Here Annie joins in, asking if he isn't the same boy that took part in that Team Rocket raid that was all over the news. It sure is lucky that the authorities had him on their side, and they didn't lose any of his Pokemon in the raid.
Hearing the barbs hidden beneath the words, Leaf hastily attempts to change the subject, turning to Oakley and asking through gritted teeth whether she's still looking to buy a new phone. After all, with her old one broken, she hasn't been able to get any calls from her boss in about a week. Oakley, her voice dripping with the syrupy sweetness of cheap candy, tells her darling sister that she can't afford a new phone, remember? However, in her heightened sense of emotion, Leaf is like a Growlithe with a bone. insisting that she saw a phone vending machine just through the door. The cheapest one in the line should be within Oakley's price range, and while it's not great, it's better than nothing, right? After all, she doesn't want to upset her manager by missing any more of her calls. So go on, buy it! By now, Leaf's voice has taken on a slightly shrill cadence, and knowing things could get out of hand if not properly nipped in the bud, Oakley leans in, harshly whispering at the brunette to get a hold of herself since she's causing a scene. Thankfully, having reached a similar conclusion, Annie had decided to simply solve the problem in the quickest means possible, tossing Oakley the cheap phone while asking if Leaf is happy now. At once, it's like a spell has been broken, as the youngest member of the trio looks up at her sisters with wide eyes, reeling just how erratic she'd been acting a moment ago. This is bad. This is really, really bad, since she can't be freaking out like this, especially not in public. Something is definitely wrong with her. All the emotions she'd learnt to compartmentalize are leaking out, and if she cannot get them back under control, no, that is not worth thinking about. She must get them under control, so she will. That has always been the way she operated, and she has no intention of changing now. The sound of shattering glass rings through the room as a remote crashes through the screen of a large TV, embedding itself in the internal wiring of the box. On the other side of the room, standing behind a desk with her arms still outstretched from the throw, Domino glares at the ruined remains of the TV. This proves it. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but now there's no other explanation. Giovanni is not coming back.
When she'd received word about the raid on the base in Celadon, she'd been impressed, but not overly worried. Giovanni had already suspected that the Ash Brat would try something, and had taken precautions accordingly. 003 may have failed in her mission, but that was just one of many plans Giovanni had laid to ensure the Brat's compliance, with it being all but assured that after this little spate of rebellion, the boy would be brought to heel. However, as the raid ended and more reports began to flood in, it became increasingly clear that things had not gone as planned. Many of their number had been arrested, they'd lost their interim headquarters, and one of their most lucrative sources of revenue. But even with all their losses, there was not a single word from Giovanni. No orders, no words of warning if they were going to be raided too, not even a message saying that he was on his way. None of the reports from the grunts who'd escaped mentioned the boss, with Domino interrogating them personally when they began arriving. All that any of them had been able to tell her is that he'd been in his office with the Ash Brat. Some of them had gone in to see if Giovanni had needed any assistance with the police, but when they arrived, no one was there. Domino had not wanted to believe that the Ash Brat could have done something to Giovanni. A kid taking down a full-grown man, who was also the head of the most powerful organization in Kanto? Ridiculous. Yet, she'd seen the proof with her own eyes. That brat battling in the Pokemon League. Usually, she'd leave observing the battles to the lower ranks, as it rarely turned up anyone suitable for recruitment into Team Rocket. But with the understaffing, the mess that needs to be sorted, and everything else, she'd decided that she deserved a break. And watching some ambitious brats fight their silly little hearts out seemed like a good way to both get a laugh and do some work at the same time.
It had been moderately entertaining, and Little Oak Jr.'s battles had reminded her that she still needed to think of a punishment for 003 for not taking the brat's Pokemon when she had the chance. But then, a boy with brown eyes and black hair had stepped onto the field, and that was the moment she realized two bitter truths. The Ash Brat is alive, and if the Ash Brat is alive, then, in all likelihood, Giovanni is dead. It's been a week since the encounter in the mess hall, and at long last, the beginner and the advanced classes are having a joint session on the battlefields. Where once, these sessions would have filled Leaf with dread, now all she feels is a nervous but unmistakably determined sense of drive. She's spent the last week observing and analysing number 2, and she's been able to learn 3 things. 1, she's got quite the inferiority complex, constantly talking down to all of the other trainees, treating them like scum under her shoe. She even attempts to do this with Miss Number 1, only to be left unsatisfied when the other girl points out the difference in their rank. 2, she's reckless. She's not subtle about anything. The only reason she's been able to maintain her second place position is because of her fighting and battling abilities and because of her ruthlessness. And 3, she loves targeting the beginner classes during battle training, especially those that on some subconscious level she views as a threat. And that is exactly what Leaf has been making herself out to be for the last week, hitting number 2 right in her weak spot. Her skills at the more subtle side of training. Be it her hacking, her infiltration, her psychoanalysis, every word of commendation directed towards her and the other girl's presence only serves to increase the girl's ire. And now, it is time to put all of the built-up anger to work.
As expected, number 2 singles out Leaf for battle as soon as she is able, with the young brunette putting on a good show of battling, until she has her Cubone use Bone Club on Toxapex's side. While ostensibly this is meant as a sneak attack, this is merely cover for its true purpose, with Leaf waiting until she is sure her ulterior motive has been achieved before having Cubone keel over, having specifically allowed it to be poisoned earlier so this sudden collapse would not seem out of place. While number 2 is gloating over her win, the Proctor tells Leaf to get her Cubone healed up before she loses another Pokemon. A snide jab the girl takes in stride, since if all goes to plan, soon this belligerent old crone will be her subordinate. Taking care to ensure that Cubone's club remains hidden, Leaf then lifts Cubone into her arms before walking off the field, having to resist the urge to run like hell, as it feels like every eye is upon her. Thankfully, no one stops her retreat, so the moment she reaches her room, she places Cubone on her bed and pulls a jar out of her pocket. Smiling proudly despite the pain of the poison, Cubone holds out his club to her, showing off the yellow-tipped blue spines lodged in the bone, proof positive that their scheme was a success. Not wanting to risk poking herself with the spines, she grabs a pair of tweezers from her manicure kit, then with careful precision she wriggles each spine free, before dropping them in the jar. Prudently she only pulls out 3, leaving the rest in the club, since it'd be suspicious for the club to be riddled with holes but have no discernible cause. With that done, she tapes the jar to the underside of her bed next to the tally marks, before pulling an antidote out of her drawer, and using it on Cubone, healing his poison. After all, she needs an excuse for why she took so long getting to the infirmary. Knowing that it's only a matter of time before number 1 and 2 get into another spat, Leaf decides to wait for one to happen naturally, then enact her plan a few hours after. That way she has time to mentally prepare herself and everyone will connect the poisoning to number 2, not only because of the type of poison, but the argument. It is a flawless plan, or rather one with just one flaw. Leaf hadn't expected them to get into an explosive confrontation that very evening at dinner. This is too soon. She hasn't had time to prepare. She needs more time. If you don't act now, a voice in the back of her head whispers, when will you get another chance? You're running out of time. It's them or you. Recognizing the truth of these words, Leaf accelerates her timeline, hastily provoking a fight between 2 of the last remaining trainees by throwing food at one, while making it look like it was the other trainee. With tension so high already, it doesn't take long for the 2 to begin brawling, and wanting to gain extra points by showing she can command others and keep them in line, number 1 turns her back on her rival, and goes to break up the fight with her Vesperquin. As Leaf had hoped, this only incenses number 2 more, who stands from her seat and takes off after number 1, declaring that she will not be shown up by some prissy princess.
While everyone is gathered around to watch the brawl, or more smartly, stay far away from it, Leaf calmly walks past number 1's food, acting like she's emulating the smart ones. As she passes, she squeezes a few drops from the Toxapex spine into her coffee, not breaking her stride once. Then, once she's on the other side of the room, she sits down and waits for the instructors to enter the scene. As expected, they waste no time in breaking up the fight, sending everyone except the 2 that had been fighting back to their seats. Smugly, number 1 walks back to her food, while number 2 glares at her. All the while, Leaf watches out the corner of her eye as number 1 picks up her coffee and takes a long, satisfied sip. For a moment, Leaf's blood runs cold as her target's face twists in a grimace as soon as she swallows. Has she tasted the venom? Was her strategy that transparent? Is this the end of the road for her? However, these fears are allayed a moment later as number 1 tosses the cup into the trash, muttering about how it's gone cold. Nevertheless, she did take a sip, with that being enough. In fact, it might even be better. It'll take the venom more time to take effect, leaving Leaf completely in the clear. After all, even the smallest drop of Toxapex venom leaves permanent damage. That night, Leaf is woken up by the ear-splitting sounds of someone screaming. Jumping out of bed, she grabs her Pokeball as she runs for the door, suspecting an attack from the other trainees. Throwing the door open, she sees that she's not the only one in the hall. the majority of the remaining trainees having also emerged with their Pokemon to investigate the screams, which are echoing from further down the hall and getting louder. Before any of them can take more than a few steps towards the screams, however, they see the familiar black uniforms of the proctors coming down the hall, carrying a screaming bundle on a stretcher. Tersely, the proctor at the front snaps for them all to get back to their rooms, reminding them that there's a curfew in effect. Though as they race past the group of confused trainees, Leaf sees who's on the stretcher, Little Miss Number 1, screaming in agony as her body spasms. Without a word, Leaf re-enters the room, firmly closing and locking the door behind her. Even when she is alone, her face remains impassive as she climbs into bed, her eyes locked on the ceiling while one hand clutches Cubone's Pokeball on her nightstand. Sleep does not come for Leaf after that, with her lying awake, utterly motionless. All the while, her rationale pounds inside her skull with each heartbeat, turning itself into a mantra. It was her or me. It was her or me. In the time since leaving Saffron City, Leaf has remained quiet, speaking only when spoken to, and even then with some reluctance. In her mind, she is adrift, unable to trust herself, unable to trust her sisters, with her only companion being the paranoia that gnaws at her constantly like a pack of hungry ratata. It is therefore a great relief when she spots the familiar forest that surrounds Pokemon Tech. They're less than a day's journey from their destination, and they can hide in the trees for the rest of it. Though with it being so late, they decide to camp for the night and finish their journey in the morning.
While preparing, Oakley tells Leaf to go fetch some firewood, while she and Annie call Domino, and not wanting to be around for that particular call, the young brunette heads off to gather wood without argument. Dialing the secret number on their cheap burner phone, Annie and Oakley inform their boss they'll be at Pokemon Tech by midday tomorrow, something that evidently pleases Domino, though before they can end the call, she notifies the duo there's something she needs them to do before they arrive: dispose of Leaf. After her failures to both keep the Ashbrat in line and steal Oak Jr.'s Pokemon when she had him helpless, it's clear that she's lost her touch, and so is now a liability. As they well know, weakness such as that will not be tolerated in the Tulips, so they had to complete their task, then rendezvous with her when they are done, so they can get to work figuring out what comes next for Team Rocket. Understood? For a moment, Annie and Oakley say nothing, exchanging a look that makes it clear they're having the same thought. Then, in a flat business-like tone, they state that they understand. A week has passed since the incident that has come to be known as Number 1's worst night. It was discovered rather quickly that Toxapex venom was the cause of the girl's condition, and after that, things went exactly to plan. It all turned out so well that Leaf was tempted to think it was going too well, her paranoia being at odds with her confidence with her plan's execution. Okay, poor choice of words. If she were to be honest, she'd been half expecting Annie and Oakley to go back on their end of the deal the moment the deed was done. But to her pleasant surprise, the older girls have been keeping their end of the bargain ever since they took the number 5 and 4 spots. Since then, they'd sabotaged several other rivals, though none of them had needed to be taken out in as dramatic a fashion as the first two. Thanks to this, Leaf's own stock had been on the rise, with her being surprised when that morning she had checked the current rankings to find herself also in the top 5.
However, no joy can last forever, and so just as Leaf is getting ready for another day of training, two proctors barge into her room, causing her to jump. Grabbing her, the duo Frogadier march Leaf through the halls, their grip leaving bruises on her arms. Knowing that attempting to fight back will only make things worse for her, the young trainee allows herself to be dragged into an office where 4 other girls are sitting in front of a desk, while a large chair is turned away from them. Nervously, Leaf looks at the other 4 girls as she's shoved into the empty chair, her stomach churning with fear as she sees that Annie and Oakley are also there. Briefly, the trio share a glance, not able to communicate verbally considering the situation, though it's plain to see from the look in Annie and Oakley's eyes that they have no idea what's going on either. Before they can continue their silent conversation, however, the door behind them closes with a click and the chair behind the desk spins around to reveal Domino, who is smiling like Christmas has come early. In a happy sing-song voice, she congratulates the 5 of them and informs them that they've all passed their final exam. They've all displayed the intelligence, the strategic minds, the ambition, and the ruthlessness that is required to be part of Team Rocket's illustrious Tulips. She then turns to look directly at Annie, Oakley, and Leaf, continuing that some of them have even shown their willingness to strike deals and play nice with others to further their own goals, which will serve them well when they need to babysit the grunts. Letting Letting out a dreamy sigh, the Tulip 2IC then begins to reminisce about her own days as a trainee, aiming to be one of the elites. In order to secure her position, she poisoned almost everyone in her class until there were only 5 of them left. So she's very impressed that they were able to keep the casualties to a minimum. This gives Team Rocket some very nice cannon fodder for when needed. Leaf feels sick as she realizes that the backstabbing was part of the point of the final exam. They were meant to sabotage each other and get away with it. Except they didn't get away with it, did they? Because Domino knows about it. She's brought back as Domino tells the 5 that they were able to fool the Proctors, which is what was needed. But make no mistake, nothing ever gets past her. So if they do anything that she doesn't like, she will know. And she will not tolerate anything that she doesn't approve of from her subordinates. All through this, she maintains her unsettlingly pleasant smile.
With this said, she tells the girls to go pack their things and waves them off like she's shooing away some naughty children. As she leaves the office, Leaf can feel the walls closing in around her. She's made it. She's in the elite group. But now she's going to be under that woman. A woman that talked about killing all but 5 of her class like it was a happy childhood memory. She'll have to stay on her guard, since it's like Domino said. All it'll take is one wrong move and... Suddenly, Leaf feels a hand squeezing her shoulder, and her head snaps up, panic on her face. Though instead of Domino, she sees Annie and Oakley standing in front of her. In a rational tone, Oakley tells her to follow her breathing, while Annie tells her not to look so freaked out. After all, they did it. They won. After a few moments, Leaf regains control of her breathing, allowing the older girls to step back, as in a flat tone, Oakley states that just so she knows, this changes nothing. Looking bewildered, Leaf asks what she's talking about, with this earning her a smirk as Annie asks if she's forgotten their deal. She does as they ask, and they take care of her. That's how it works. Got it? For a moment, Leaf is at a loss for words. Then she feels something odd. A smile. The first genuine smile she's had in a long time creep its way into her face. Then as she looks up into the eyes of her new big sisters, she nods. Got it. Back in the present, Annie and Oakley are about to end their call with Domino. As the de facto leader of their cell, Oakley briefly takes a moment to speak to the Tulip Commander alone, with this giving Annie time to kneel down and grab a stick. As the blue-haired sister is halfway through her farewell with their boss, Annie breaks the branch in her hands, creating a loud snap that even Domino can hear over the phone. Spinning around to look at the empty space behind her, Oakley gasps Leaf's name for asking the air how long she'd been standing there. Annie stands back up from her crouching position, telling Leaf not to do anything stupid, before letting out a grunt of pain and throwing herself to the ground with a thud. Oakley follows up Annie's grunt of pain with a scream, dropping the phone to the ground before stomping on it, breaking it in half and cutting the call.
With the phone broken, Annie quickly gets back to her feet, softly grumbling about now having a sore butt. Before they can say or do anything else, Leaf comes bursting through the trees with her Marowak, looking ready for a fight, only to blink in confusion as she lays eyes on Annie and Oakley. Frowning in irritation, Leaf puts her hands on her hips, demanding to know just what that scream was about a moment ago. Walking up to her baby sister, Oakley kneels down and places her hands on Leaf's shoulders. Looking her dead in the eye, she tells her that she's not going back to Pokemon Tech. Following suit, Annie kneels next to her older sister, adding that Domino has put Leaf on her hit list, so she needs to get away from Pokemon Tech. Out of Kanto entirely if she wants to live. Stunned by the news, Leaf stares at her sisters, asking why they're doing this. If Domino finds out about them letting her go, she'll kill them for sure. However, with a fond smile, the older girls tell her that they know, but they're 001 and 002 of the Tulips. And though they may not be good people per se, they're not so despicable as to turn on one of their own. Feeling heartsick, Leaf asks what they're even talking about. For crying out loud, if they're willing to help her, then why not just come with her? Though here, Oakley shakes her head, saying that as tempting as that is, they are far too in deep with Team Rocket to just run. Leaf didn't think that they were letting her take on the dirtiest missions or look into the most confidential information, did she? There are some things that someone Leaf's age should never have to witness. let alone do. Leaf may be a tulip, but she is far cleaner than either of them. This earns a mirthless laugh from the brunette as she points out the numerous things that she's done that would beg to differ. However, Annie tells her that the fact that she can still list those sins and still feel guilty over them is proof that they're right. Still unwilling to lose her sisters, Leaf then points out that if that's true for her, then it's true for them. So why can't they come with her? They could escape together. There's no reason for them to go back unless them going with her would turn them into priority one. They're staying behind to save her, aren't they? Something in the resolute look Annie and Oakley give Leaf confirms this. Though when they speak, it is simply to remind her that on the day they became sisters, they made her a promise. So for Arceus' sake, let them take care of her one last time. Choking back a sob, Leaf throws her arms around her sisters, holding them like this will be the last time they will ever see each other. After a moment, the girls separate and Annie and Oakley call out their Pokemon to stand next to Marowak, telling them that if they're going to sell this, they're going to need to make it look authentic, so they've got to beat them up. Not enough to do serious damage, but enough to make it look like Leaf roughed them up and stole Espeon and Ariados. In unison, the Pokemon nod their understanding, before reluctantly attacking the duo, with Marowak leaving bruises with his club, Ariados dispensing strands of weapon and sporadic puncture wounds from Fellstinger, and Espeon delivering a volley of thin cuts with Magical Leaf.
Once Annie and Oakley are convincingly covered in injuries, they hand Ariados and Espeon's Pokeballs over to Leaf, who takes them gingerly. Returning all three of the Pokemon, she turns to Annie and Oakley one last time. For a moment she's at a loss for what to say. There's so much she wants to tell her sisters, yet she can't find the words or where to start. After what feels like an eternity, she decides there's only really one thing she can say. So looking at her sisters, she simply says goodbye, then turns and begins to run. The sun is up by the time Leaf finally stops running, feeling as though she's gotten enough of a head start to put some distance between her and Pokemon tech. But now that she's stopped, she has no idea where she's supposed to go. Like Annie and Oakley said, she can't stay in Kanto, but the world is so big. How is she supposed to decide on which way to go? Grabbing Marowak's Pokeball with a tired expression, she brings him out, and once he's in front of her, she tells him to throw his club into the air. When it lands, whichever way it's pointing, that's the direction they'll go. Nodding, the ground type throws his club high, with it twirling end over end, before finally landing with its head facing west. West it is then. Allowing Marowak to stay by her side, the girl then begins to march, her mind reeling with thousands of thoughts on what she's going to need to do to stay hidden from a lot of people, actually, since it seems the only ones she hasn't pissed off at this point are her Pokemon. The first thing she's going to need is a new identity, a new name. But what name should she take? All of her old names are completely out. They'll be sure to attract attention. A name that is completely detached from her would make the most sense. But she's lived so long like that. Maybe the real way to throw people off would be to have a name that means something to her. She thinks back on her life, on all of the moments that she felt something. Not just happiness, but sadness, curiosity, frustration, determination, excitement. The moments when she felt human, and the people that made her feel that way. She thinks about Ash, about Gary, Silver, Misty, Brock, Richie, Annie and Oakley. After a while, she smiles. Yes, that name will do nicely.
And that's where we'll leave things. Though before we go, we have a few announcements to make.
As alluded to at the start, this is the first of several specials showing what our favorite heroes and anti-heroes have been up to in the wake of Season 2, and Gray's mysterious disappearance.
These will be released across the various channels involved in the GSA Universe, so be sure to subscribe to them all so you don't miss out.
Also, speaking of things you won't want to miss out on, Pickle and I are hard at work on GSA Season 2.5, which covers May and Max's adventures as members of Team Aqua and Magma, while also featuring several key characters such as Ash and Meowth. So if you haven't watched that, go give it a look, as you never know who might turn up next.
But with all of that said, we'd like to thank you for watching.
And we'll see you
as the journey continues.